For centuries, one dynasty ruled a civilization older than time itself. They commanded armies that stretched across mountains, rivers, and deserts. They built palaces of gold and painted the skies with their power. Yet even the mightiest empire can crumble. Secrets, betrayal, and a tide of foreign invaders would bring the last imperial dynasty of China to its knees. This is a story of glory, greed, and the fall of kings. A story that will reveal how an empire, untouchable for centuries, finally met its end. Stay with us, because by the end of this journey, you will witness the death of an empire and the world it once ruled. For over 2 millennia, China was ruled by dynasties families, whose power, tradition, and ambition shaped the destiny of one of the world's oldest civilizations. But every dynasty, no matter how powerful, eventually meets its end. This is the story of the last imperial dynasty of China, the Qing Dynasty, a reign of grandeur, intrigue, and ultimate collapse. The Qing dynasty did not originate from the heart of China. It was founded by the Manchus, a nomadic people from the northeastern region of modern-day China known as Manchuria. Their ancestors had once roamed the forests and steppes, living by their own laws and customs, far from the civilized courts of the Ming Empire. In the early 17th century, the Ming dynasty was weakening corrupt officials. Peasant revolts and internal strife left China vulnerable. The Manchus, under the leadership of Narache, and later his son Hongtiji, seized this opportunity. Through a mix of military strategy, diplomacy, and cultural assimilation, they gradually gained control over northern China. By 1644, the Ming dynasty had collapsed under the weight of rebellion and internal corruption. Beijing fell into the hands of the Manchu army, and the Qing dynasty was officially established. From that moment, the Manchus would rule China for over 2 centuries, adopting many Chinese traditions while maintaining their own distinct identity. The early emperors of the Qing dynasty were extraordinary rulers. Kangxi, the 4th emperor, ascended the throne at the tender age of 7 and would reign for 61 years. Under his leadership, the empire expanded its borders to unprecedented size, encompassing Tibet, Mongolia, and Taiwan. China became a beacon of power and culture. The Qing rulers blended their own Manchu traditions with Chinese Confucian governance. They implemented policies that encouraged agriculture, commerce, and scholarship. The arts flourished. Painting, porcelain, literature, and architecture reached new heights. It was an age of stability, order, and prosperity. Yet beneath this golden era, cracks began to appear. While the empire was vast and wealthy, its population grew exponentially, putting pressure on land, food, and resources. The rigid imperial system, designed centuries earlier, struggled to adapt to the changing needs of the people. By the late 18th century, the Qing dynasty faced unprecedented challenges. Corruption within the imperial bureaucracy weakened the government. Officials often abused their power, enriching themselves while the common people suffered. Heavy taxation and famine fueled resentment across the provinces. At the same time, foreign powers were knocking at China's gates. European nations, armed with modern weaponry and driven by a desire for trade and influence, began to exploit China's weaknesses. The Opium Wars of the 19th century exposed the Qing's inability to defend its own sovereignty. Opium flowed into China, devastating society. Millions became addicted, while silver drained from the empire to pay for the narcotic. The Qing court was torn between moral outrage and political helplessness. This period marked the beginning of a slow, irreversible decline. The Qing dynasty had once been the jewel of Asia, vast, powerful, and respected. But the seeds of decline were already sown: internal corruption, overpopulation, and the encroachment of foreign powers. The storm was approaching, one that would shake the very foundations of the last imperial dynasty in China. By the 19th century, the vast Qing Empire was showing cracks impossible to ignore. The population had exploded, stretching food supplies to the breaking point. Corruption festered in the imperial courts, and the people, once loyal, were growing restless. From the south rose a rebellion so immense it threatened to tear China apart from within. The Taiping Rebellion, led by a visionary who claimed to be the brother of Jesus Christ, ignited a civil war unlike any China had ever seen. Millions died in battles that ravaged the countryside. Villages vanished, rivers ran red with blood, and the Qing rulers struggled to respond. It was a wound that weakened the empire for decades. As internal chaos tore at the empire's heart, foreign powers exploited China's weakness. Britain, armed with industrial weaponry, forced open trade with opium, bringing wealth to their coffers and addiction to Chinese society. The First Opium War erupted, and the Qing, unprepared for modern warfare, suffered devastating defeats. Cities were captured, ports surrendered, and China was humiliated by unequal treaties that stripped it of sovereignty and wealth. The Second Opium War followed, compounding the nation's misery. Beijing itself was invaded. The summer palaces, symbols of imperial grandeur, were looted and burned. The dynasty's image of invincibility was shattered. The people began to question not just their rulers, but the very system that had governed China for centuries. By the turn of the century, a wave of nationalist and anti-foreign sentiment surged. The Boxer Rebellion erupted, fueled by anger over foreign intrusion and Christian missionary influence. The Qing court, trapped between supporting the Boxers and appeasing foreign powers, found itself powerless. Armies from Europe and Japan marched through Beijing once again, forcing humiliating concessions and further eroding imperial authority. Each rebellion, each treaty, chipped away at the Qing's legitimacy. The emperor still wore his golden robes, but the people no longer feared him. Loyalty, once unshakable, began to crumble. From every corner of the empire, voices rose demanding reform, change, and justice. The dynasty that had ruled with divine authority for over 250 years now teetered on the brink of collapse. The 19th century had transformed China. The Last Imperial Dynasty had survived centuries, but the world outside was no longer the one it had once ruled. Foreign powers advanced with guns and steam, while domestic rebellions tore the land apart. The stage was set for the ultimate confrontation between a crumbling empire and the unstoppable tide of modern history. The Qing dynasty's decline was no longer gradual, it was accelerating. And soon, the forces of rebellion, modernization, and foreign domination would collide in a final, unstoppable wave that would sweep the last emperor from his throne forever. Ever wonder how a 2,000-year-old imperial system just ends? Let's talk about the fall of China's last dynasty, the Qing. It's a story of internal rot, external pressure, and one very young emperor caught in the middle. By the late 19th century, the mighty Qing dynasty was struggling. They were dealing with devastating internal rebellions, like the Taiping Rebellion, which cost millions of lives. At the same time, Western powers were knocking on their door, and not in a friendly way. The Opium Wars forced China to open its ports and cede territory, like Hong Kong to the British. It was a period known as the Century of Humiliation, and the Qing government seemed powerless to stop it. Inside the Forbidden City, the real power wasn't with the emperor, but with Empress Dowager. For decades, she held the reins, navigating court politics with an iron fist. But her conservative approach often clashed with officials who saw the need for modernization. They tried reforms, like the 100 Days Reform, to modernize the military, economy, and education system. But these efforts were often crushed by conservative forces at court. It was too little, too late. Then, in 1908, a 2-year-old boy named Pui was placed on the dragon throne. Imagine being a toddler in charge of a crumbling empire. He was the last emperor. But he was just a child, a pawn in a much larger game. The final blow came in 1911 with the Wushang Uprising. It sparked a series of revolts across the country, known as the Xinhai Revolution. Provinces declared their independence from Qing rule one by one. The revolutionary leader, Sun Yat-sen, was declared the provisional president of the new Republic of China. Facing overwhelming pressure and with the army defecting, the imperial court had no choice. On February 12, 1912, the young Emperor Pui officially abdicated. Who's like that? Over 2 millennia of imperial rule in China came to a quiet, dramatic end. The fall of the Qing dynasty wasn't just the end of an era, it was the birth of modern China. What do you think was the biggest factor in their downfall? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into history. With the abdication of the last emperor, China entered a new era. The Qing dynasty was gone, but its shadow lingered over the land. The old order had fallen, yet the people faced uncertainty. What comes after centuries of imperial rule is never easy. The empire's vast bureaucracy, its traditions, and its rituals were dismantled almost overnight. Pui, the final emperor, was only a child when he lost his throne. He would live much of his life as a symbol, first in captivity, then in a world far removed from the imperial court. Though he no longer ruled, the echoes of his dynasty's power haunted him and the nation. The fall of the Qing was not just the fall of a family, but the end of a civilization built on thousands of years of dynastic rule. The end of imperial rule brought new challenges. The Republic of China struggled to unify a nation fractured by centuries of regional loyalties and foreign encroachment. Warlords carved out territories. Foreign powers continued to influence trade and politics. The transition from a centralized, absolute monarchy to a republic was turbulent and often violent. Yet the fall of the Qing also sparked a renaissance of ideas. Confucian traditions were questioned, Western science and philosophy were studied, and modern education began to spread. The Chinese people began to envision a future unbound by emperors, where power could belong to the people rather than a distant throne. Even as the dynasty vanished, its legacy endured. The Qing had expanded China's borders to their modern shape, preserved centuries of culture, art, and architecture, and left lessons about power, governance, and human ambition. Their rise and fall reminded the world that even the most invincible empires are vulnerable to time, change, and the will of the people. The story of the Last Imperial Dynasty is a story of grandeur and downfall, of ambition and human fragility. It is a tale that spans centuries, where power and legacy intertwine with pride, hubris, and destiny. The Qing dynasty is gone, but China endures stronger, wiser, and forever shaped by the empire that once ruled it. This was the rise and fall of the Last Imperial Dynasty of China, a civilization at its peak, then at its end, leaving behind a story that still resonates across time and borders. The fall of the Qing dynasty wasn't just an end, it was a beginning for a nation searching for its identity after centuries of imperial rule. At the heart of this storm was the last emperor, Pui. Once a symbol of absolute power, he became a man trapped between the past and the future. After his abdication, Puyi's life was a whirlwind of exile, manipulation, and forced He watched as warlords tore the country apart, as foreign powers invaded, and as the People's Republic rose from the ashes. The former ruler was now just a spectator of history, a living relic of an era that had vanished. But the Qing dynasty's legacy didn't disappear with him. You can still see its influence in China's vast borders, its rich culture, its stunning architecture, and its timeless traditions. The Forbidden City, once a palace of dragons and emperors, stands today as a monument to the empire's ambition and magnificence. Its tales of glory and collapse continue to captivate scholars, artists, and historians all over the world. The story of China's last imperial dynasty is a powerful lesson about power and fragility. It shows us that no empire, no matter how mighty or long-lasting, can escape the currents of change. Time, new ideas, and the collective will of the people are forces far stronger than any emperor. And yet, despite all that was lost, China endured. It rebuilt itself, reimagined its future, and carried the lessons of its past forward. The emperors may be gone, but the spirit of the civilization they once ruled lives on, ever-evolving and unbroken. The last imperial dynasty of China has ended, but its story a saga of ambition, triumph, and the inevitable fall from power will echo through history forever. As the winds of change continue to shape our world, one truth remains. Empires may fall, but history never forgets.